Space Harrier was a revolutionary game in terms of graphics and style. Developed by Sega and produced by Yu Suzuki, this legendary game hit the arcades in December 1985, utilizing a fully hydraulic arcade cabinet that would tilt the player in 4 directions. Originally, Space Harrier was conceived as a realistic military-themed game, played in the third-person perspective and had the player controlling a fighter jet. Technical and memory restrictions at the time resulted in Yu Suzuki redesigning the game to fit a fantasy setting centered around a jet-propelled human character. Believe it or not, Yu Suzuki got his inspiration from the 1984 movie The Never-Ending Story, which would explain the bonus stage dragon. Space Harrier contains 18 stages, with 15 of them containing an end-of-stage boss. Critically praised for its innovative graphics and gameplay, Space Harrier is often ranked amongst Suzuki's best works, and considered the first successful entry into the world of third-person on-rail shooter games. The very first port of Space Harrier went to the Sega Master System. Developed in-house by Sega, this port is really good considering the specs of the Master System. It contains pretty much everything from the arcade machine and even plays really well. The game also features a few Easter eggs thrown in. The original arcade game never had a story, but if you leave the demo looping on the Master System, you will get one. There's also a cheat to allow you to play as a jet in homage to the original idea behind Space Harrier. A year later, Space Harrier 3D was released for the Master System. While the 3D effect was excellent, the actual game was slow and jerky. It wasn't much fun, to be honest. We all know that the Amstrad CPC has a lot of trouble with moving games at a swift pace, so the developers of Space Harrier did something rather special. Instead of using sprites for everything, they used vector graphics. What a great idea! The game runs pretty smoothly and even manages to save enough CPU power for an excellent rendition of the main theme song. Sadly, the game is a little difficult to play due to the very poor collision detection. The game is also missing bosses. Still, for what it is, I think this is an excellent attempt.
Welcome to the fantasy zone. Get ready.
Chris Hutt is the man responsible for this unofficial 2011 port of Space Harrier to the Atari 8-bit line of computers. This man is a master of programming. What we have here is a very close copy of the arcade game running super smooth on a system it shouldn't even be possible to run it on at this quality. The port plays perfectly and even features high quality voice samples from the arcade machine. Unfortunately, I had problems getting the colours to work right, so it does look a little off here. One thing that can be said about the ZX Spectrum port of Space Harrier is that it's fast, with some smooth scaling. Unfortunately, just like the Amstrad CPC version we saw earlier, this port doesn't follow the arcade enemy placement as well as it could, making for a bit of a frustrating experience. The lack of music and farting sound effects don't help either. The NEC PC 6001 was a 1981 home computer for Japan by NEC. It really wasn't made with games in mind. In fact, it was a business machine. Yet here it is playing Space Harrier. Okay, it looks as basic as can be, with its block-like graphics, but it actually plays well and smooth to boot.
Welcome to the fantasy zone. Get ready.
Of course, Space Harrier had to be on the king of arcade ports, the Sharp X68000. However, this version is not as good as you might have thought it'd be. The game is constantly slowing down to the point where it affects gameplay. This is especially evident on the boss battles. There's also issues with the channels missing on the audio when firing your weapon or hearing explosions. This is not to say the Sharp X68000 port of Space Harrier is awful, but it could have been better. Japanese business computer port action with the Fujitsu FM77 AV. Looking nicer than the NEC systems, this port was one that shows you were playing with power. back in the day. Not the best of its time, but respectable for sure. There are two official ports of Space Harrier for the Commodore 64. First, let's take a look at the Sega developed port. This features some pretty cool renditions of the arcade soundtrack, including individual boss tracks. It does lose a few stages from the arcade and the controls are reversed, so in this port up is up and down is down. There are also a few collision detection issues, but overall, it's rather good for the C64. The Elite version is basically a ruined version of the Sega port. It's now much faster, making the controls too twitchy. It's also a lot harder, and for some reason, some of the graphics have been changed and the floor textures are completely gone. If you own a C64, then you want the official Sega port, not this rubbish by Elite.
Welcome to the fantasy zone. Get ready.
Just like the NEC PC 6001, the NEC PC 8801 is a computer primarily designed for business use, not games. So, just like its predecessor, this version also has primitive graphics. What did surprise me is the quality of the music. A million times better than what DOS computers were pumping out at the time, for sure. Developed by Denpa, who as I always mention are now better known as the makers of the Framemeister, Famicom Soft, comes this Sharp X1 port, yet another Japanese home computer from the early 80s. 82 in the case of this machine. Just like the X68000, the X1 was years ahead of its time, as we can tell by looking at this version of Space Harrier compared to the NEC PC 8801 version, which is the same age as the X1. It's not without slowdown issues and the graphics are chunky, but it plays well and sounds even better with that great stereo soundtrack. NEC Avenue ported Space Harrier to the PC Engine, and as we all know, NEC Avenue loved to make games harder. In this port you only get 2 lives and no continues, although you can earn extra new lives if you score enough points. As for the quality of the port, well, it's not bad at all. Probably more impressive than Space Harrier 2 on the Mega Drive. Talking of the Mega Drive, speech in this port sounds like it's from a Mega Drive game. As with all the home computer ports in Europe, the Atari ST version was published by Elite. It's pretty reasonable all things considered. It may not be as smooth as the older Japanese home computer ports, but it does look fairly nice for an Atari ST game. Strangely, this game only allows you to control it with the mouse. The ST also saw a release of a 20-stage version of Space Harrier, which sometimes goes under the title of Space Harrier Plus. I bet you were all expecting the Amiga version to be a poor Atari ST port. Well, not this time. The Amiga gets its own version from an unknown developer going under the name of Melnock. I bet you're all wondering, is it better than the Atari ST version? Well, yes and no. It does look better in my opinion, but the controls are not right, plus the amount of movement you have on the vertical plane is quite limited. The game also has pretty awful audio clipping too, sound effects cutting off most of the music. But again, like the ST version, this isn't that bad for an Amiga.
Get ready. Get ready.
You thought Sega games on the Nintendo console was something from the modern age of gaming. To be fair, Takada actually handled this port to the Famicom, and what a stinker it is. I don't know why Takada thought it would be a good idea to have sky objects floating towards the floor as they got nearer to you. Also, why does Harrier move so slowly? Sometimes it's impossible to move out of the way. This port may look smoother than its main rival, the Master System, but it's nowhere near close to it in the gameplay department. Okay, the MS-DOS port does look better than the Japanese home computer of the CGA age, but even those sounded pleasant. This sounds awful, and no, before you ask, there are no better sound options. As for the game, well, it's poorly based upon the SD port. This MS-DOS version is very twitchy in the control department and runs at a terrible frame rate, making everything jerk about the screen. Not a very nice experience. Sega sure love porting Master System games to the Game Gear, yet Space Harrier is more than just a cut down port. What we get here is an enhanced version with stereo remixed audio, new graphics and the password system to allow you to continue playing the following day. Game Gear port looks pretty cramped, but surprisingly it doesn't feel cramped when playing. Sega have managed to alter the stage design just enough to give the illusion of a larger play area.
Welcome to the fantasy zone. Get ready.
Upon first impressions, the 32X port of Space Harrier looks and sounds arcade perfect. Well, it does sound arcade perfect, but it's certainly not when it comes to gameplay. So what's different? Well, for the start, the arcade machine runs at 60 frames per second. This 32X port runs at 30 frames per second and drops frames when things get busy. The arcade port uses analog controls. The 32X doesn't, which does alter the feeling of the control a little for the true Space Harrier fan. Still, it is an amazing port and a must for any 32X owner.
Welcome to the fantasy zone. Get ready.
Now this is what it's all about. The Sega Saturn port is practically arcade perfect. Running at 60 frames per second with graphics indistinguishable from the arcade machine and a soundtrack that's slightly beefed up. We also get loads of options to choose from, including analog stick configurations to allow the game to play just like the arcade machine. There's even an option to change the shadows from the Saturn to the arcade version. Easily the best home console port of Space Harrier out there.
Get ready. Welcome to the fantasy zone. Get ready. Oh!
Now this is the second best version of Space Harrier out there. Running at 60 frames per second just like the Saturn port, this is arcade perfect. The only reason it's not number one is because it's missing any type of option mode. You can reverse the pad controls, mind you, by holding down one of the buttons while pressing start. This particular version you're seeing here is running from the Yu Suzuki Gameworks Volume 1 disc for the Dreamcast. It can also be found on Shenmue 1 and 2.
Welcome to the Fantasy Zone. Get ready.
Space Harrier for the PlayStation 2 is awful. Even when you set the graphics to use the basic checkered floor, it still manages to look bad. It's not only the looks which are an issue, but also the way the game sounds and plays. Effects are too loud and the controls are stiff. This is one bad port. Found on the Sega Arcade Gallery for Gameboy Advance, this port by Bits Corporation is reasonable. It is missing a lot of animation, has music that's off key at times, and does run a little slow too. But still, we're playing Space Harrier on the move. This was the only way back then, unless you resorted to emulation. Okay, this isn't actually Space Harrier for Android, but it is a game based upon Space Harrier, even right down to the enemy placements. In fact, this game plays just like HD sprite swapped version of Space Harrier. Even the music has some similarities. There were many different official versions of Space Harrier for Java-based mobile phones. Some are good, such as the ports for Japanese phones in the mid-2000s, and some are awful. Then there are others which are average at best, such as this port running here.
Welcome to the fantasy zone. Get ready.
And finally, the version of Space Harrier that many would say is the ultimate port. This amazing Nintendo 3DS port by the masters of arcade emulation ports, M2, features so many options you wouldn't believe it. Not only does the game feature very impressive 3D, but also mimics the hydraulic arcade cabinet by tilting the screen. Absolutely amazing. And let's take a look at all those versions of Space Harrier running side by side.